Just picture yourself trapped and abandoned in the heart of the terrifyingly vast ocean without a sign of land for a staggering 438 days, a fate more horrific than death itself. Unfortunately, this is a very real incident, and this happened to Jose Salvador Alvarenga, the man in today's story. In the dark and stormy month of November 2012, he set out on a fishing trip off the treacherous coast of Mexico. 2 days later, a raging storm hit and things took a horrifying turn. He made a desperate SOS, hoping that his plea for help would be heard and soon he would be saved, but that never happened. So with that, his long, dark nights all alone in the vast and unforgiving ocean began. Jose Salvador Alvarenga was born in 1975 in Garita Palmera, El Salvador, to Jose Ricardo Orellana and Maria Julia Alvarenga. His parents owned a flour mill and store in the town. With several siblings, he grew up. However, once he was around 27 years old, he left El Salvador in 2002 for Mexico, where he worked as a fisherman. There he got employed by Wilhelmino Rodriguez, who was a boat owner and Jose's boss at the time of this incident. So about a decade went by since he moved to Mexico, and at this point he has become a very well experienced and skilled fisherman. As of the time of his disappearance at sea, he had not been in touch with his family in 8 years. So it was November 17th of 2012 when Jose had planned to go on this fishing trip. He prepared the boat with Ray Perez, his usual mate and a loyal companion, but unexpectedly at the last second something came up and Ray could not join. Now obviously going solo was not an option. Jose was so frustrated as he was too keen on getting out to sea on the planned date. Thus, he arranged to go with Ezequiel Cordoba instead, a 22-year-old with the nickname Piñata who lived at the far end of the lagoon, where he was best known as a defensive star on the village soccer team. Although Jose and Piñata had almost never spoken to each other before, much less worked together, they got along very well and finally began their journey out to sea on November 17. It started off on a very positive note. The weather was great and the ocean was calm. The two men were already able to catch a ton of fish. But the nature's calmness, however, did not last long as a sudden and wrathful storm hit, ambushing the two sailors at sea. They didn't realize it at the time, but they were in serious danger. At this point, they have navigated about 50 miles away from the shore, and to get back would not be as easy in the middle of a massive storm. Piñata was in complete panic mode. He had never been through a storm while at sea. In fact, he was a novice and did not have enough experience in sailing. On the other hand, Jose was level-headed, standing in the growing pond of seawater sloshing at his feet. If someone who did not have enough experience in sailing was in his shoes, they might have freaked out just like Piñata and started trying to bail out the water. But, well, Jose was a pro and knew the most important thing was to keep the boat aligned with the waves. So, with his inexperienced crewmate, Jose was slowly making the way back to shore, which, like I said, was 50 miles away. The spray and crashing waves dumped hundreds of gallons of seawater into the boat, threatening to sink or flip them. Piñata was desperately throwing water out of the boat while Jose was steering, though Piñata still had to take breaks every so often because his shoulders were getting tired. Jose's boat was as long as 2 pickup trucks and as wide as one. With no raised structure, no glass and no running lights, it was virtually invisible at sea. On the deck, they had a big box made of fiberglass that was filled with fresh tuna, mahi-mahi and sharks they had caught after being out at sea for 2 days as of this point. If they could sell it when they got back to shore, they would have enough cash to live on for a whole week. The boat was loaded with equipment including 70 gallons of gasoline, 16 gallons of water, 50 pounds of sardines for bait, 700 hooks, tons of fishing line, a harpoon, 3 knives, 3 buckets for bailing, a cell phone in a plastic bag to keep it dry, a GPS tracker that was not waterproof, a 2-way radio with a half-charged battery, some wrenches for the motor, and 200 pounds of ice. Well, that is a lot, but that is what you need for a fishing trip. Jose was trying hard to steer the boat towards the shore, navigating through the waves like a surfer trying to glide and slice his way through. As the weather got worse, Piñata lost his determination as he was already panicking and scared for his life. At times, he didn't even want to bail out water from the boat and instead held onto the side, puking and crying. He had signed up to make $50 and was usually okay with working long hours without complaining. He was athletic and strong, but this journey back to the shore with all the crashing waves and water soaking them was too much for him. He was convinced that their small boat would break apart and that sharks would come and eat them. He started screaming. Jose was sitting down, holding on to the steering thingy tightly, determined to steer through a storm so bad that people in charge of the harbor had stopped fishing boats from going out to sea. Eventually, he saw that the clouds were clearing up and he could see for miles across the water. Then around 9 in the morning, he saw a mountain rising on the horizon. They were about 2 hours away from land when the boat's engine started making some weird noises. He took the radio out and called his boss, shouting, "Willie, Willie, Willie, the motor is ruined. Calm down, man, give me your coordinates." Willie responded from the beachside docks in Costa Azul. "We have no GPS, it's not functioning. Lay an anchor," Willie ordered. "We have no anchor," Jose said. He had noticed it was missing before setting off, but didn't think that he would need it on a deep-sea mission. "Okay, we are coming to get you," Willie responded. "Come now, I'm really getting screwed out here," Jose shouted, and these were his final words to show. As the waves hit the boat with such unbelievably brutal force, Jose and Piñata started working together. When the sun came up, they could see the waves approaching really high above them and then splitting open. Each man would brace and lean against the side of the open-hulled boat to counteract the roll. The waves were all over the place, crashing into each other in mid-air and making big waves that would lift the men up super high, giving them a crazy third-story view and then drop them down just as fast like they were in a falling elevator. Their beach sandals they were wearing were also not helping either, as they had no traction on the boat deck. Jose figured out the huge amount of fish they caught, almost 500 kilos or 1100 pounds, was making the boat too heavy and wobbly. He didn't have time to try to ask his boss for advice, so he just went with his instincts and decided to throw all the fish overboard. They took the fish out of the cooler and chucked them into the sea one by one. It was pretty risky because the bloody fish would surely attract sharks, making it even more dangerous to fall overboard. Then they threw away the ice and some extra gasoline. Jose hung 50 buoys on the boat to act as a sea anchor that floated on the surface to keep the boat stable. But at around 10 a.m., the radio stopped working. It was before noon on day 1 of a storm that Jose knew would probably last 5 days. Losing the GPS was an inconvenience, but the broken motor was a tragic turning point. And now, without the radio contact, they were on their own in the middle of the ocean. The storm was enraging the men all afternoon as they were struggling to scoop water out of the boat. They kept doing the same thing over and over, using the same muscles hour after hour, and they were able to get rid of some water. They were both so tired they felt like they were going to pass out, but Jose was also really furious. He grabbed a big stick that they usually used to kill fish and started smashing the broken engine. Then he grabbed the radio and GPS unit and threw them into the water in a fit of rage. The sun went down and the storm was getting pretty worse, and Piñata and Jose started feeling really cold. They flipped the giant icebox over and crawled inside to keep warm. They were completely wet and their hands were so cold that they could barely make a fist, so they hugged each other tightly and wrapped their legs around each other. But the boat was filling up with water, so they had to take turns getting out of the icebox to scoop the water out for about 10 or 15 minutes at a time. It was hard work, but they managed to make some progress and the amount of water in the boat slowly went down. It got really dark and super strong wind pushed the guys even further out to sea. They didn't know if they were back where they were fishing the day before or if they were going north towards Acapulco or south towards Panama. They had lost their usual means of calculating distance and therefore had to solely rely on the stars to figure out where they were going. Since they did not have any bait or fish hooks, Jose came up with a risky plan to catch fish. He got down on his knees next to the edge of the boat and looked out for sharks. Then he put his arm in the water up to his shoulders and pressed his chest against the side of the boat to keep himself steady. He kept his hands still, hoping that some fish would swim into them. When a fish swam through his hands, Jose quickly grabbed it and closed his fists, dragging his nails into the rough scales of the fish. At first he missed some fish and they got away, but soon he got the hang of it and started catching fish like a pro. He would grab the fish and then throw them into the boat, being careful to avoid their teeth. Piñata was really good with the fishing knife, so he cleaned and cut the fish into small stripes and left them in the sun to dry. They ate fish after fish until they were full. Jose ate raw fish and dried fish without really paying attention to the difference or even what he was eating at all. He didn't care if it was cooked or not. Sometimes they were lucky enough to catch turtles and flying fish that landed in their boat, and they ate those too. After a few days, Jose started drinking his own urine and urged Piñata to do the same. Although it was salty, it did not taste too bad, so he kept drinking it and peeing again in a cycle. He thought, well, it would help the dehydration, but in reality, it was actually making things worse. Jose knew that drinking seawater was dangerous, so they didn't even consider it, despite how thirsty they were. They resisted the urge to drink even a small amount of salty water that surrounded them. At times, Jose got so hungry that he was eating his own fingernails, swallowing all the little pieces. He started grabbing jellyfish from the water and swallowing them whole. Although it burned the top of his throat, he thought it was not too terrible. So after being at sea for 14 days, Jose was taking a rest inside the icebox when he heard the sound of raindrops hitting the roof. He got too excited and shouted "Piñata, Piñata, Piñata" to his crewmate, who woke up and joined him. They quickly went down to the deck and set up a rainwater collection system that Jose had been designing and imagining for a week. Piñata cleaned a gray 5-gallon bucket and placed it with the opening facing the sky. The sky became dark and gloomy. Finally, a storm arrived and the rain poured down on the men after days of being extremely thirsty and drinking their own urine and turtle blood. They were overjoyed and stripped off their clothes to take a shower in the rain. The rainwater collected in the bucket and they drank it happily. They were careful not to drink too much though, and decided to ration the water to make it last longer. Now, after being at sea for weeks, Jose and Piñata got really good at finding and collecting different kinds of plastic floating on the water. They made sure to grab any empty water bottles they saw, and when they came across a green garbage bag, they pulled it onto their boat and tore it open to see what was inside. They were pretty excited to find a big piece of gum and they split it between them to enjoy the flavors. They also found some good stuff like half a head of cabbage, some carrots and a quart of milk, even though it was kinda old. This was the first fresh food they had seen or had in a really long time, so they treated it with a lot of respect. Once they had enough food to last for a few days, and especially after they caught and ate a turtle, Jose and Piñata briefly found some solace in the magnificent seascape and enjoyed looking at the breathtaking scenery around them. They would chat about their moms and how they as sons did not always behave well. They asked God for forgiveness for being bad sons and wished they could give their moms a hug and a kiss. They promised to work harder so their moms would not have to work anymore, but well, they knew it was too late. After being at sea for 2 months now, Jose got used to catching and eating birds and turtles, but Piñata was starting to feel worse and worse both physically and mentally. Even though they were on the same boat, they were going on different paths. At one point, Piñata got really sick from eating raw sea birds and he made a big decision. He stopped eating altogether. He held on to a plastic water bottle but did not have enough energy or motivation to bring it up to his mouth. Jose tried to offer him small bits of bird meat and sometimes even turtle, but Piñata would not eat anything. He was so depressed that it was making his body shut down. The two men made a pact. If Piñata managed to survive, he promised to go to El Salvador and visit Jose's mom and dad. But if Jose made it out alive, he planned to go back to Chiapas, Mexico and find Piñata's mom, who was a devout mother that had married an evangelical preacher. Piñata asked Jose to tell his mom that he was sad, he could not say goodbye, that she should not make any more tamales for him. They should let him go, that he had gone with God.
I'm dying, I'm almost gone, Piñata said one morning.
Don't think about it, let's take a nap,
Jose replied as he lay alongside Piñata. I'm tired, I want water, Piñata moaned.
Jose noticed that Piñata was having a hard time breathing. He grabbed the water bottle and held it up to Piñata's mouth, but he didn't drink any of it. Instead, he stretched out his body and started shaking. He groaned and his body became tense. Now this scared Jose a lot and he suddenly panicked. He yelled at Piñata right in his face, trying to get him to respond. A little while later, he died with his eyes still open. Jose lifted him up to keep him out of the water. He was worried that a big wave might come and wash him overboard. Then he cried for hours and hours. The next morning, he looked at Piñata, who was in the bow of the boat, and he spoke to the corpse. How do you feel? Have you had breakfast? Jose just simply talked to himself and answered his own questions out loud, as if he was imagining Piñata was speaking to him from the afterlife. He found it easier to cope with the fact that he had lost his only friend by pretending that he was still alive. Then about 6 days passed since Piñata's death. Jose was talking to the corpse while sitting with it on a dark, moonless night. He was so engrossed in the conversation that he suddenly realized, as if waking from a dream, that he was actually talking to a dead body. It was like all of a sudden he snapped back to reality. Jose decided to wash Piñata's feet first. He found his clothes useful, so he took a pair of shorts and a sweatshirt off of him. Jose wore the sweatshirt, which was red and had little skull and crossbones on it. Then he put the body in the water and suddenly passed out. When he woke up a few minutes later, Jose was absolutely petrified and devastated. He thought to himself, what am I going to do by myself? Who am I going to even talk to? He was feeling guilty about his friend's death because he's the one who asked him to go fishing. He kept thinking, why did he have to die and not me? It's all my fault. Even though he wanted to give up and end his life, he had a strong will to live and a fear of suicide, as his mom had told him when he was a little kid that people who kill themselves cannot go to heaven. So he kept trying to find a way out and looked all over the ocean for any signs of help. The best times to look were during sunrise and sunset, when he could see blurry shapes become clear silhouettes and the sun was not too hot. Jose trained his eyes to spot even the tiniest speck on the horizon as a ship. When a ship came closer, he could tell what kind of ship it was, usually a big trans-Pacific container ship that traveled across the Pacific Ocean. These ships were huge and seemed to glide across the water with no crew or activity on the deck, like giant robots and drones at sea. Every time he saw a ship, it gave him a burst of energy that made him wave, jump, and flail his arms for hours. He saw at least 20 different container ships pass by on the horizon, but even though it was frustrating to not get rescued, he still felt excited every time he saw one. Sometimes storms hit his little boat, but as he got further out to sea, the storms did not last as long and were easier to handle. To stay sane, Jose let his mind wander and he imagined things that seemed so real and he felt he was actually experiencing them. In his mind, he had the best food and sex of his life while alone at sea. He got tremendously good at making his lonely life into a fantasy world. He would start his day with a long walk. He would walk back and forth on the boat and pretend like he was wandering the world. It made him feel like he was doing something instead of just sitting there and thinking about dying. By pretending he had all these people with him, family, friends and girlfriends, he was able to escape from the depressing reality around him. When he was a little kid, his grandpa showed him how to keep track of time using cycles of the moon. Now that he was alone in the wide open ocean, he always knew how many months he had been adrift, by counting how many times the moon had changed. He had seen 15 lunar cycles since he had started drifting into the unknown waters. He believed that the next place he was going was heaven, because there's no way he's going to survive. He's in the middle of nowhere of the endless ocean. It's understandable that he would think that way. In other words, by this point, it had been 14 to 15 months since Jose first set off on the fishing trip. On January 30th of 2014, which was another usual day to Jose at the unknown territory of the ocean, he was cruising along smoothly with the current when all of a sudden, tons of shorebirds filled the sky. Jose was staring in amazement and his neck muscles got tense. He saw a tropical island appear out of nowhere in the mist. It was a little green hill surrounded by a bunch of different shades of blue and green water. He had been experiencing hallucinations way too often, but they never lasted very long. But this time, it seemed like it might be real. Jose's mind was racing with all the different things that could go wrong. Maybe he could get blown off the coast or drift backwards as it had happened to him before. He kept staring at the land, trying to make out all the details from afar. He guessed that it was a super small island about the size of a football team. It looked really wild and didn't seem to have any roads, cars or houses on it. He used his knife to chop off the ragged line of buoys. This was a really drastic and risky decision because without the buoys, he didn't have anything to anchor the boat with during a storm, and it could easily tip over even in a not so bad tropical storm. But Jose could see the shoreline clearly and he gambled that the speed was of greater importance than stability. So after about an hour, he floated close to the island's beach. When he got about 10 yards away from the shore, he jumped into the water and swam like a turtle until a big wave carried him and threw him onto the beach, just like a piece of driftwood. When the wave pulled away, he was left lying face down on the sand. In utter bliss, he held onto the handful of sand like it was the most valuable thing in the world. The famished fisherman crawled naked through a bunch of wet palm leaves, pointed coconut shells, and even some yummy flowers. He could not stand up for very long because he was so weak. He was completely wrecked and as thin as a board. All he had left was his intestines and gut, plus skin and bones. His arms were fragile looking with no meat on them, and his thighs were just bony. Even though he didn't realize it, Jose had ended up on Tile Islet, which is a small island that's part of the Airborne Atoll located at the very bottom of the 1156 islands that make up the Republic of Marshall Islands. As he was walking through the bushes, he suddenly saw a canal that separated him from a beach house where Amy and her husband Russell lived. Amy works on the island husking and drying coconuts. She said, "I was looking across the canal and I saw this man over there.
He was shouting and looked very weak and hungry. I thought to myself, this person probably swam here and must have fallen off a ship. After they slowly approached each other, Amy and Russell let him come inside their house. Jose tried to draw a picture of a boat, a person, and the show, but he gave up because he didn't know how to explain his 7,000-mile journey at sea with simple drawings. He started to feel impatient and asked for medicine and a doctor, but the local couple just smiled and shook their heads. Even though we could not understand each other, I just kept talking and talking, Jose said later. The more I talked, the more we laughed out loud. I don't really know why we were laughing, but I think I did because I was so happy to be rescued. So after spending the morning taking care of the castaway and feeding him, Russell sailed his boat across a lagoon to the main town and port on the island of Aben to ask the mayor for assistance. In just a few hours, a group of people, including police and a nurse, arrived to help rescue Jose. However, they had to convince him to get on a boat with them back to Aben. While they were nursing Jose back to health and trying to get more information about his journey, an anthropologist from Norway who was visiting the island told Marshall Islands Journal about him. So with that, on 31st of January, the remarkable rumors of the news of Jose's story was made public. Jose was not ready for what was coming. Reporters from Hawaii, Los Angeles, and Australia scrambled to reach the island to interview him, though at the time, he was only known as the alleged castaway. The story was so mind-blowingly scary and incredible that at first, reporters had to take their time to confirm all the facts and make this story a little bit more easier for the public to believe. People debated whether his story was legit, as it sounded like the most incredible survival story in all of human history. Ultimately, enough evidence was found, such as the missing person case filed by the families of Jose and Piñata, the correlation of Jose's drift with the known ocean currents, and even Jose's supervisor's confirmation that the registration number of the boat Jose had washed up in was the same as the one that had left port on 17th of November in 2012. So eventually, people began to believe his tale. While all this was happening, Jose's health was getting worse back in Marshall Islands. His feet and legs were really swollen, and the doctors thought it was because his tissues had been without water for so long that they were now absorbing everything. However, after 11 days, the doctors decided that Jose was well enough to go back to El Salvador to be with his family. This is him returning home. A lot of people were there to welcome him, including the press and the government authorities. But as you can see, he is clearly uncomfortable to be seen by so many people at once after being stranded and isolated at sea for so long. He didn't even make eye contact with anyone at first. He was found to have anemia, and the doctors thought that eating raw turtles and birds may have infected his liver with parasites. He was worried that the parasites might go to his head and hurt his brain, so he couldn't sleep at night and kept thinking about Piñata's death. He didn't feel the same celebrating his survival alone. As soon as he was feeling better, he went to Mexico to keep his promise to deliver a message to Piñata's mother, Ana Rosa. He spent 2 hours with her answering all her questions. Life on land has been tough for Jose. He was really scared for many months and was afraid of not only the ocean but even the sight of water. He slept with the lights on and needed someone with him all the time. Shortly after he was rescued, he hired a lawyer to deal with all the media requests that flooded in from all around the world. However, later Jose switched lawyers, and his previous lawyer filed a lawsuit claiming that Jose had breached the contract and owed him $1 million. It sounds like the poor guy just cannot seem to get a break. It took Jose about a year to fully understand the amazing 7,000-mile journey he had been through. During his 438 days adrift in the Pacific Ocean, he had struggled with hunger, thirst, and extreme loneliness, but he never gave up on life.
Looking back on his experience, he realized how precious life is and that we should all be grateful for it. So in the end, Jose Salvador Alvarenga did not really end up in heaven like he thought he would while being on the brink of death, at least not yet. He went through so much that most humans can never even think of bearing. Through his sheer determination, he ultimately found his way back to land and his loved ones. I am happy to say that his dream to make his mom happy and proud can still be realized. Alright knights, with that we have got to the end of this absolutely unforgettable and amazing story. This was definitely one of my favorite stories to make a video on. I hope you enjoyed it and even learned something. I will see you soon with another story like this. Until then, stay safe out there and goodbye.